ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಸೈನ್ಸ್ ಸಂಜೆಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಆಧಾರದ ಸ್ವಾಗತ. ಇಂದಿನ ಅತಿಥಿ ದೇವಯಾನಿ ಖರೆ. ದೇವಯಾನಿ ಖರೆ ಅವರು ಪುಣೆಯ ನಗರದವರಾಗಿದ್ದು ಪ್ರಸ್ತುತವಾಗಿ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರು NCBS ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಸೆಂಟರ್ ಫಾರ್ ಬಯಾಲಜಿಕಲ್ ಸೈನ್ಸಸ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಕೇಶನ್ಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಔಟ್ರೀಚ್ ಮ್ಯಾನೇಜರ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದರು. ಅವರು ಭೂಗೋಳ ಶಾಸ್ತ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ನಾತಕೋತ್ತರ ಪದವಿ ಪಡೆದಿದ್ದು ಜಿಯೋಮಾರ್ಫಾಲಜಿ ಅಧ್ಯಯನದಲ್ಲಿ ತೊಡಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇಂದಿನ ಸೈನ್ಸ್ ಸಂಜೆ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಕಲ್ಲು ಹೇಳುವ ಕತೆ, ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಭೂ ಪರಂಪರೆಯ ವೈಭವ, ಸ್ಟೋರೀಸ್ ಇನ್ ಸ್ಟೋನ್, ಕರ್ನಾಟಕಸ್ ಜಿಯೋ ಹೆರಿಟೇಜ್ ವಂಡರ್ಸ್ ಎಂಬ ವಿಷಯದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತನಾಡಲಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ದೇವಯಾನಿ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಕಲಾಸುರುಚಿ ಹಾಗೂ ಕುತೂಹಲಿಯ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಆದರದ ಸ್ವಾಗತ ಕೋರುತ್ತೇನೆ. ವೆಲ್ಕಮ್. ದಯಮಾಡಿ ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ತಮ್ಮ ಮೊಬೈಲ್ ಫೋನ್ಗಳನ್ನು ಸೈಲೆಂಟ್ ಅಥವಾ ಸ್ವಿಚ್ ಆಫ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕೆಂದು ಕೇಳಿಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I understood most of it. The rest of the talks could be in English. Sorry, I haven't made the effort to learn Kannada just yet. I'm getting there. I understand it, I just don't speak it. Also, I think for a lot of us, you know how complicated it is to explain scientific concepts in local languages. I mean, Dr. Poligar does it beautifully, but I'd be hard pressed to do it in Marathi as well. Another thought is, ideally a topic like this should not be done indoors, but we can't take everyone out to field, and Karnataka is a huge state. So what I've elected to do instead is take you on a virtual tour. And these places are most likely places you've already been to. So mostly you'll be taking a journey into your memories, and I'll just be focusing on what it is about these places that tell certain stories. Tell certain stories through the millennia. Apart from having worked at NCBS, right now I work and I write about geoscience. I've been doing it for a few years. And I studied what's known as geomorphology. A lot of people mistake it for geology, but I promise you my geology is all self-taught. That's how our education system is. And what I learned instead is about landscapes, how they evolve, how they change over time. And today what I'm going to be talking to you about is about some of these wonders, right? So let's jump right into it. What are we thinking about when we talk of landscapes? First off, we are looking at geodiversity, which represents all of your rocks and fossils and minerals and natural processes that are somewhere embedded within the landscapes and landforms that you see around you, and that intrinsically form the environment that we move through every day. Not just in India, anywhere else, how we could classify geodiversity could be by looking at singular monuments. One feature that you see, an interesting rockscape perhaps, right? One particular island that says something very pretty. Just a feature that tells you something about the history of the earth. That's a geomonument. Then you have fossil sites. For a lot of people, there is the belief that a fossil site is actually skeletal remains, but it really isn't. It's an imprint of skeletal remains. Sometimes a fossil can be a single pug mark of an ancient creature. It could be the scat, right? The droppings of an animal that have been fossilized through time. It can also just be a tree that's gotten fossilized, the impression of it. All of these sites can also represent our geodiversity. Then you have archaeological sites. This speaks a little bit more to us because we're looking at civilizations, we're looking at people like us, but several millennia ago, and we understand their stories better. So very famously, sites of archaeology in India are things like the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, but Bellary also has some very fascinating archaeological sites. I can't cover all of these within this talk, but what we will be looking at are landscapes. And what are landscapes? They're series of landforms. And in India, very often, because we go to preserve one or more of these, we fail to look at the landscape and the story that it's telling to see why it needs to be preserved. So what is a landscape? We'll quickly go back to school geography. This is a diagram that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, or we drew something similar in school. And these are different landforms, right? You can see some of your usual suspects there, your plateaus, your caves, lakes, rivers, all of these are landforms. And how all of them come together, that is known as a landscape. But what really causes these landscapes to form? By and large, there are three major processes that we look at. Again, something we studied in school, but since then you would have also seen the word weathering and erosion used interchangeably, but they're very different processes in some ways. Weathering is when rocks get or disintegrate within a single location. They remain right there, the disintegrated remains. If because of wind or water or ice, that weathered material moves from one place to the other, that is known as erosion. And when that material is moved and transported somewhere else and left there, it's known as deposition. And the mix of these three processes is what will shape all of our landforms. Don't worry, we're going to step up from here beyond school, but this was just a context I want us to have before we jump into some of the familiar landscapes. This is again a concept that is familiar. What are some of the agents that have shaped landscape over time? Water in all of its different forms, fast-running water like rivers, flash floods, or even slow-moving water like glacial ice. All of this shape and sculpt landforms over time. You also have tectonic movements, which can be incredibly fast, something like volcanoes and earthquakes within hours. In fact, your entire landscape is changed. Or it can be slow-moving tectonic processes like landslides, which could shape and change your landscapes. And ultimately, you have plants, corals, and humans that are very, very important in shaping landscapes the way you see them today. Of course, there are other kinds of wind and land movements. In a tropical country like India's, we have lesser wind action than water. We are always mostly sculpted by rainwater. So let's get to the crux of the talk. What is geoheritage? Now, this is a word that you would have seen in the poster perhaps. And in some ways, we speak a lot in this country about cultural heritage. We know what that is. All of our temples, all of our monuments, palaces. Mysore is most famous for its cultural heritage. But what of the geological heritage? What about landscapes and how much of a deeper time story it can tell us? And this is what we're trying to do. Geoheritage is something that tells you about the evolution of the earth. So we're talking about stories that can stretch as far back as 4.5 billion years. 4.54 to be very exact. And in fact, there are some such landforms and landscapes in Karnataka that are telling you these billion-year-old stories, right? Can just wait for... Okay, thank you. So what we're thinking of when we think of geoheritage is, does it have scientific interest? Can it further our understanding of the past? Does it have educational interest or value? Can it teach us something? Can it teach the generations something outside of their textbooks? And as I said, ideally I would have liked to take you out instead of sitting indoors for this talk. And finally, because in India, all of our monuments and our heritage needs to have some sustainability, we need to see if people would pay to come to such places. So geotourism is important so that we can collect revenue and make sure that these monuments are protected and preserved. Just before I dive into some of the landscapes, I want you to think of what these sites that we're going to virtually visit today, tell us about human history, tell us about the evolution and survival of biodiversity. What can it tell us about past climates and geology? And finally, what within this can teach us of the history of the earth and the universe, right? So what we're looking at is human history, which within India's context stretches back something like 70,000 years, contested facts. You're looking at the evolution and survival of biodiversity. I think biodiversity itself emerged on Earth something like 2.5 billion years ago. So that's how deep a story you can tell. And both your past climates, geology, and the history of the Earth goes back around 4.54 billion years, and the universe is anyone's guess. So, not too far from Bangalore, a little north of where I live, in fact, is a formation that most of you would be familiar with, Nandi Hills. Nandi Hills dates roughly between 3.2 to 3.5 billion years, and it is among the oldest rock formations of the Indian subcontinent. Till recently, it was considered the oldest rock, but Singhbhum in Jharkhand has beat Nandi, I think a couple of years ago, but Nandi is still among the oldest rock formations. And you don't need to go all the way to Nandi to see a formation like this. There are formations like this across this entire stretch. But what does this formation indicate? It's what's known as a craton. And a craton represents the oldest part of the peninsula, stretching way back before India came to be at the position it is at today, which is just a little south of Eurasia and so far into the northern hemisphere. So Nandi Hills actually tells us of a time when this little plate, the little triangle of India in a way, was way, way south in the hemisphere, and it was still a part of a bigger continent. Then if you go a little further on the route between Bangalore to Hubli and take a little bit of a detour after Chitradur, you come to a little place called Madhihalli. Not very protected, it's a tiny rocky outcrop that most people will miss out on. But what's incredible is it actually has a formation that's roughly 2.5 billion years old. Think of roughly where Chitradur is, right? It's so far inland of the peninsula. But this particular formation indicates that at some point in time, this little chunk of earth was deep, deep, deep under the surface of the ocean. How do we know this? Because of what are known as pillow lava formations. At some point in time, the volcanic activity on the ocean bed erupted. All of this magma is flowing out, and it's come into contact with ocean water, cold, deep pressure ocean water. What happened is it rapidly cooled, right? And what you're seeing on the outside is this hardened crust. Almost think of bread, right? Like crust on the outside and these little airy pillow-like formations inside. That's what there is at Madhihalli. We have a couple of other formations like this across India as well, but Madhihalli's one is getting mined quite quickly, and it's one tiny little outcrop that, again, most people would miss out on. Then let's move to roughly the border of Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. And what you have is the Kolar gold fields. That is roughly an hour away from Bangalore. And interestingly, the story at Kolar Goldfields goes beyond the formation of just Earth. It's actually telling you of certain collapsed and dead stars from anybody's estimate ago, right? And what's happened at some point is these stars have died, they've collapsed upon themselves, there's helium gas, there's streaks of gold, a bit of dust, that all got repackaged as a massive asteroid and started hurtling its way through space. We don't know how far it's traveled, but we do know that roughly 2.5 billion years ago, that one particular asteroid among many such fallen stars came and fell and impacted at Kolar. And all of the gold seams on this planet, and that's why the ones at Kolar, are the insides of dead stars. right? And then over time, of course, we've mined this area, and with rainwater, a lot of the gold seams have accumulated in rivers and streams, and which is why now what we're able to do is just sieve some of these dead stars and make all of our fancy jewelry. Think of it, extraterrestrial. Next, let's journey to the coast of Karnataka. West Coast, I'm sure most of you have driven down this road. Udupi, Mangalore, both popular destinations. But a lesser known feature there is this group of 4 islands of St. Mary's, among which one island of Coconut Island has these incredible formations. I hope the photo is clear, but what it looks like are these hexagonal columns rising out in the middle of nowhere, one island. Now, formations like this are present elsewhere in India, but what makes St. Mary's Island very rare is it is along the coast. And nowhere else in India do we have such an incredible formation along the coast. When we look at it and we realize that it's basalt, for a long time people thought that it's the same formation that gave rise to the Deccan Plateaus, as we know. It's all basalt, layers upon layers of basalt. But no, when they actually studied it, they found that it's a little older than that, roughly 85 million years ago. And this formation represents where India unzipped from the Madagascar island at some point. And almost geographically parallel in Madagascar, north of Madagascar, in fact, there's a place called Nosy Be, has exactly the same formations. So this is around 85 million years ago. You have this greater India as it was, a mix of Seychelles, Madagascar, India, that all unzipped. And today what you see of the Western Ghats, these Western escarpments in a way also, these mountains also unzipped exactly. There is a proxy in Madagascar, even with the Palpad Gap, right? It's a 30-kilometer gap between the mountains. Even that is reflected in the mountains in Madagascar. It's called the name evades me for now, and it's known as the Ranotsara Gap. So you have the Western Ghats on this side, and you have another mountain chain, which are exactly identical with this particular basalt formation as well. Travel a little north, another, I think, Karnataka's best loved and most touted geographical hotspot. I think over the years, most of us have seen just how little water flows at Zog Falls. But what's incredible is Zog Falls, again, as you can see, the time travel that we've been doing, this is pretty recent history as geology goes, right? It's just roughly 2.5 million years ago. But what Zog Falls represents is where the river Sharavati has been traveling over these Deccan traps that have formed, and at some point, the Ghats taper off, right? The Western Ghats basically dip right into the coast, and the river is forced to plunge, literally jump off that cliff, because it needs to move towards the coast. And that's what the Zog Falls represents. It dips into a beautiful gorge, and for a little while, so a gorge is literally like a little crack in the rock, and for a little while, this free-flowing river that has just taken this leap of faith across this escarpment and tumble down into this thing is forced to restrict itself and flow within this narrow gorge. And that's your Zog Falls. Again, as I said, these landscapes are not unfamiliar to you. I'm sure a lot of you have traveled through them. I want you to consider 2 thoughts of what these landscapes could mean. There's a very interesting perspective that speaks of landscape as something that bears a memory. As I said, when you look at a gold seam, when you look at a craton of Nandi, or you look at hexagonal basalt columns, they carry with it the memory of past processes. So in some ways, that imprint of past processes upon the landscapes we see today is called landscape memory. But another flip side to that same thought is, what about the memories we carry of the landscapes itself? Can that be the fourth dimension to a landscape beyond time and space? So, what do landscapes mean to you? How many people here have been to Yana Rocks? Not too many. Frankly, even I haven't. Because it's always been something that's there at the edge. So you would know these features better than me. And I'm guessing, though few of us have traveled there, everyone knows the story of Bhasmasur, right? So you have one Asur, great boon, turns everything to ash, and at some point in time, Mohini has been asked to vanquish this Asur who's just gotten power crazy. And finally, while she's leading him around, she's dancing, he's dancing, and so on. And at some point, she puts her hand on her head, and Bhasmasur turns to ash. Right there. Right? This is the memory of a landscape that we have put through. But what Yana Rocks is, in some ways, again, roughly over 200 kilometers inland. No, a little lesser, sorry, 90 kilometers inland from Gokarna, right? Yana Rocks used to, at one point, be coral reefs. How do I know this? Because what limestone is ultimately, and this little molten candle kind of formation that you have, is nothing but disintegrated coral formations that over years have converted to limestone. And even if you haven't visited Yana Rocks, you may have visited some other limestone caves in India, and you know how they look. Over time, with a lot of rainwater has formed acid, and acid has literally scored these landscapes to form these beautiful caves under Yana Rocks. Am I right? There are temples below these rock formations, right? And what have we done with temples as we do with all geoheritage? We built shrines there. And who do we worship underground in India? Usually Shiv. And interestingly, though this Shikhar is supposed to be Bhasmasur's remains, I think it's called Mohini Shikhar, and the other one's called Bhairaveshwar Shikhar. So, this is the memory of a landscape which used to be coral, which has disintegrated into limestone, which has over years been carved by rainwater. And today, what we do is we forget this deep history, we go there, offer our prayers, and we come back. In some ways, I think we can also pray for this 2.65 billion year old history. If you move further north from there, Badami, Pattadakal, Aigore, right? Now, what's incredible is that we have offered Pattadakal UNESCO recognition. Of course, the temples are incredible. The history that it tells over time, because Pattadakal and Badami, in fact, have 3 levels of architecture. I had the pleasure of traveling there with my mother, who's a PhD student in Indian art and archaeology. And she was painting this vivid picture of how you have the Vaishnavite temples, Shaivite temples, and then you have the Buddhist temples. Ultimately, why did they choose this particular landscape to even carve these temples out into? The rock. And we fail to tell the story of the rock itself. So the rock is sandstone, red sandstone. And when you think of sandstone, anywhere in the world, anywhere in India, sandstone was born in water. Now, Badami is over 235 kilometers inland. Where's the water? Not just the talab that's there, right? Not just this Agastya Tal. It was at some point in time closer to the coast. Close enough that you had a formation like the sandstone, which was formed in shallow marine environments. Over time, the deposition of sand, literally, compacted together with the help of silica to form these immense plateaus. After which, the plateaus started disintegrating and condensing. If you've traveled further north from Badami, in fact, through Goa or even through Maharashtra, past Satara, Panchgani, there are similar looking red rock plateaus. But they're wildly different. They're laterite. whereas these are red sandstone. The laterite would have been near impossible to carve into. Yet, some people have managed to do that. But this rock, the sandstone, was that much easier to chisel into and sculpt all of these temples that we have. But the other sad part is because of so much monsoon in this area, these temples are going to dissolve very quickly too. You already see a huge level of disrepair in these temples, right? And that's not just vandalism through history, which is again a sad part of things. Please come in. Just up with you. Hey, Bertie. Hello. So ultimately, what Badami is telling you is a 5.5 million to 1 billion year old story, along with the rise and fall of different religions. I guess the most favorite destination in Karnataka, everyone's been there, right? Who hasn't been there? You're going there this year, right? You have to. I think if I were to break down my top 10 destinations in the country, Hampi would rank among my top 10. There's something about the landscape that just transports you. I think you don't really need my overview of what the geology is like for the landscape to already take you places, right? I think I've imagined standing there and having this empire spread out below me. And as the storylines have come, Hampi is one of the babies on the scene, right? It's just around 10,000, 100,000 years old, which is recent history. But what's incredible about Hampi is that you will see similar formations in different parts of the country. In fact, this particular formation, known as an Inselberg, is among India's most common formations. Why is that? Remember we did Nandi at some point in time, I told you about a craton. What happens when that craton gets exposed to the natural elements over time? Little by little, you have an entire craton block with its natural cracks and fissures. And because in India, since you saw this was recent history, this is just 10,000 to 100,000 years ago, India is pretty firmly in the location it is at today. The Indian monsoon is sweeping across at different intensities over the millennia, and rainwater seeps in through these little cracks. And the cracks within this particular granite are pretty standard. They're almost, forming these little patterns, and rainwater seeps in and weathering occurs in one spot, right? So far, nobody's taken the material away. It's just weathering. And what starts happening is over deep time, you have deep weathering happening. There are all of these little boulder-like things that get isolated. And the material within it, slowly and surely, gets eroded and transported away. So what's left? A whole bunch of boulders, completely imbalanced, stacked one on top of the other, that suddenly tumble and fall and form these Inselbergs. And I think anyone who's gone through this landscape, it does look like someone's placed those boulders one on top of the other, almost as a work of art, right? And this is what's happened. You just have these exposed core stones, and you have the Inselbergs that get formed. Sometimes they can be really tiny formations, sometimes they can spread on across a huger expanse. And in some ways, to get a sense of how old the Inselbergs are, you just need to look at the core stones. If the core stones look a little angular, this was a recent formation. Because what rainwater or any kind of water does is it smoothens its work, right? Its handiwork is always polished nicely. So the Inselbergs that you will see with nicely rounded boulders, you know that they've been up and exposed for a lot longer, and they've seen a lot more rainfall than most places. Inselbergs have captured our imagination for a very long period of time. This is a painting by a British artist who came here in around 1920s, called Thomas Daniel. He came here with his nephew, and they went across India painting landscapes. And anybody else can think of any other examples where they've seen Inselbergs beyond Hampi? Chamundi is absolutely an example of an Inselberg. Ramnagar, absolutely. Actually, these formations, as I said, are spread out across the country. If you go to Mount Abu in Rajasthan, you have Inselberg formations. You start driving from Badami, because we were there just a little while ago, and start moving towards Hampi. At some point, all of that landscape is Inselberg. And then from Hampi, you start traveling south. No road takes you straight, but if you drive as the crow flies and come straight down, all around Bangalore, you have Inselberg formations. All of Bangalore's hikes and trails are Inselberg formations. You go into Tamil Nadu, all the way past Jinchi, all Inselberg formations. And all of this is just a part of the Dharwad craton. We have 5 such cratons, mega cratons in India, and 2 minor cratons, which is why Inselbergs are among the most common features across the country. And more often than not, what we've done with the Inselbergs, I think that's what's interesting. Now, these formations are typically tropical formations. You do see them in Africa and Australia too. But what's incredible about India's Inselberg formations is the history, the human history, and the human footprint. We've had pastoral communities for a very long period of time taking their cattle over these landscapes. In fact, that's what's visible in this photo as well. And what happens when the cattle goes across this landscape? They leave their droppings behind. And the droppings create very fertile soil. One, to get washed away with rain, create more acid, cause more weathering and erosion, but also to create a very fertile landscape. So in some parts of Africa, and definitely the Inselbergs in Australia, are places where there is endemic biodiversity. Biodiversity that you won't find anywhere else, because those landscapes have just been isolated for so long, but not so in India. In India, these Inselbergs are actually hubs for a lot of different kind of biodiversity. And even today, you have a lot of temples that are built on top of Inselbergs. You still have pastoral communities moving through it. So, if you thought back about any of these landscapes we've just been through, you can see that they're telling us stories at 3 different time scales. Geological time, with limestone caves, there's often biodiversity that has evolved very typically within the caves. Some blind creatures that are only found in these limestone caves and nowhere else. Some kind of flora and fauna that thrives nowhere else. That is the level of biodiversity. And finally, the story of Bhasmasur, which is the human history. Similarly, Badami, deep time, overlaid with a layer of human history, and Hampi as well. So to me, I believe landscapes are about memories, those that are captured in or imprinted upon rocks, the genetic legacy of biodiversity, and the echoes of human history. And to me, that's why we can't look at single monuments, we can't look at single archaeological sites. They're important, sure. But what's more important is the landscape that gave shape to those conditions to preserve a monument, to carve a monument, to create an area for fossil sites. And in some ways, it is to tell these landscape level stories at these 3 different scales of time that I started this little newsletter, which I didn't think would last so long, to be honest. And funnily, it started off as like a Twitter thing, where people were like, hey, you should write about this. And I'm like, seriously, people would be interested in this? But the fact that all of you are sitting here on a Saturday evening is already testimony to the fact that you're interested in stories that go beyond what we're seeing. And in some ways, to me, landscapes are like detective trails. We've just not been taught to read them right. But every one of us who's been inside a train, long journeys where we just had to stare out and wonder at life and the universe and what we're doing in it, at some point wonders what the landscapes outside are like. So, I'm 22 issues in, it's been 2.5 years, and mostly the newsletter covers India, but I have had the privilege of traveling through a couple of other geographies, 3 other geographies, Indonesia, Philippines, and Kenya, and there are these stories just waiting. So that's all from me. I'm open to questions or revisiting segments if you feel you want to. And what I'd also like to hear would be stories that you have of these specific landscapes. Anything that stood out to you? Anything that you wondered at and said, hey, but this landscape, meant something to me. I'd love to hear that too. Thank you. Yes. I should be. I'm from Maharashtra, so I should know most. We'll just keep this open if someone wants to go back. So what about Ajanta Ellora? One, that is part of these Deccan traps itself. But in some ways, of course, you know the history, the incredible change of architecture. It's carved from top to bottom in a way. But why they chose this particular site, in fact, is because it had already been sculpted over years by river action. And when they went, I would imagine, when they went looking for a suitable site, the rock at Ajanta Ellora looks very difficult to carve and would have been very difficult to carve. But the inspiration for them would have been, and in fact, the very specific formation within geology, they're known as incised meanders. So meander of the river, in fact, just carved out, and that is perhaps what gave them the idea that maybe this could be easier to sculpt into. So I think in some ways Ajanta Ellora as well is just, and Ajanta Ellora is just one set of rock cut caves, but across that stretch, in fact around this, there are other Buddhist caves. Later, a lot of Buddhist people had their little studies in these alcoves. So you have the Bhaja Bhet carving. Oh, right. Yes. Bhimbetka, I think, is in fact pretty incredible because the story of Bhimbetka is that they did not find the rock paintings at Bhimbetka first, right? Yeah. What they started doing is they started theorizing about what could be good criteria or good conditions for prehistoric human settlement. Okay, so you break it down. What do you need? You need some bit of water, you need rock shelter kind of things where people can take cover in, and you need a bit of forest. And when they analyzed India's landscapes and they identified where these 3 requirements were met, Bhimbetka was one of the potential sites. And then when they went there, ta-da, they found the rock paintings. So in some ways, Bhimbetka is again sandstone formations, softer rock, and in fact, what people have studied now over time is that it wouldn't have just been one single wave of civilization. The art indicates that there were several waves of civilization that flourished there. And in some ways, Madhya Pradesh is there are 2 spots along the Son River, which are the earliest evidence that we have for human settlements that came out of Africa. So there are excavation sites around Madhya Pradesh, and then further south as well in Andhra, where they assume that that first wave that left Africa, some say around 70,000+ years ago, came and settled, or came all the way to Madhya Pradesh for sure, and then from there they moved towards East Asia.
I think Madhya Pradesh also has very good fossil sites, and as you said, when you come down to Andhra Pradesh, there are also some fossil sites. But do we have these kind of fossil sites in Karnataka?
I've been hearing a lot about Bellary having some excellent fossils. I haven't seen them myself, but I think there's somebody in Bellary who set up And Bellary is turning out to be a treasure trove for all things archaeology. So I think there are fossils there, but ideally you need a very specific set of conditions for fossils, which is why not everywhere is conducive to fossils. And the location that you're talking about, in fact, again, something that we don't celebrate enough, it's known as the Pranita Godavari Valley. And mostly what you find is you will either have plant fossils in a site, you'll either have animal fossils in a site, or you'll have archaeological remains of human civilization. But the Pranita Godavari is one of these rare locations where all three are present. We don't publicize it enough. So, but what you need is a lot of sedimentation that happened rapidly that allowed certain imprints to remain without being long enough or tight enough to convert them into coal seams.
So that means those areas where you find the fossils had a lot of flooding and other.
Most likely, yes. And succession of flooding, if we know, because we also have the sense that the plant fossils formed a lot earlier, followed by animal fossils, and of course human civilization was that much later. So yes, there was repeated, and you can imagine a river valley being one of those places where sediments were to come thick and heavy from further around.
You mentioned the gold is typically star material.
Yes.
You need a asteroid. Is that true for all the gold deposits?
All gold deposits across the world.
They are not made within the Earth's.
No. In fact, that's why we have, like, in a way, gold is far rarer in one sense, but there are a lot of other metals that are also extraterrestrial in origin.
Water also.
Sorry?
Water also.
Water also, some desert, yes. So, but then ultimately we also had enough water that accumulated here itself. But yes, all gold reserves deposits across the planet are fallen stars.
I can understand if in one polar gold fields, one great limiting. But I believe in South Africa, for example, there are many sites where gold is based on.
We've had bombardments of
So whole of
asteroids.
South Africa is bombarded sometime back with asteroids.
Yes.
And not other places in Africa.
Lots of places, anywhere where there's gold, and the gold could have traveled as well. As I said, rivers sometimes can carry gold from one place to the other. But if a seam exists of gold, actual reserves or ores of gold, and in fact, gold is one of the rare materials that occurs pretty pure, whereas all the other metals we have to purify. This is the impact of asteroids. And at some point in time, our planet was being actively bombarded by asteroids, and these asteroids, as I said, are collapsed stars. So I think that's
That is due to contact mechanism.
at the rock, at gold,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, right. Which is,
Contact mechanism.
but which is why you have nice formations there, right? Okay, so basically when that impact is so hard, we studied three kinds of rocks in school. You have volcanic, which is all of our Deccan traps. You have sedimentary, all your sandstone, which is created, compacted over time. And there's metamorphosis. With very extreme temperatures or very extreme pressure, you have a change in rocks. So that is what. So when that asteroid would have come at whatever speed, impacted, you do have some contact metamorphosis that's happened there. But the seams itself are, and which is why they formed seams. You're right, that basically it caused that gold to melt and kind of traverse into the rocks.
So a couple of more questions. One lighter. Which is the top site in India for you? You said Hampi is part of the top 10.
I think there's a fight right now. I'm saying, yeah, the top 10 doesn't mean I have priorities. I don't know, there's a lot of them. Actually, I was really impressed by Gandikota as well. Not by what we've done to it, which is lamentable, but just the site. I feel it's one of the places where, in fact, I was joking to a doctor before this, to say, take somebody blindfolded to Gandikota, perch them on the edge and then open that blindfold. You don't need a geologist, you don't need a geographer, right? You will start asking the questions yourself because that landscape is so spectacular. And it's a pity what we do is we compare it to the Grand Canyon of USA because, of course, everything in India needs a counterpart somewhere exotic. But trust me, Gandikota is phenomenal and we are doing it a serious injustice by having no facilities there whatsoever. And right now, in fact, I went there last year or the year before, I can't remember, and they're building there's some construction going on the other side of Gandikota. It's heartbreaking. You take a photo and you see these little steel girders on the other side. I mean, it's testimony. Gandikota, in a way, is what's happened when a river over time has just kept cutting its way down, down, down into the rock. It's phenomenal, and the scale of Gandikota, no photos can do it justice. So I didn't include it, one, because it's not part of Karnataka, but two, because it wasn't just my photography skills. It really, photographs cannot do it justice. You have to visit that location for yourself. In my estimate, I think it's one of the most incredible formations of rivers within India. But there's others. Sorry, there was a question behind. I think.
Last month you were at Years, and how was it standing between two places? Like, what was the feeling standing in a place which does not exist anywhere else? East Africa.
I think it was incredible. I think it's a story of deep time in a way that India doesn't quite have. Though I really appreciate India's sites, but Kenya was cradle of civilization, right? And it sounds like something really funny in your head, but when you go there time and time again, it's a cradle of civilization. Where I passed by, in fact, speaking of fossils, the Rift Valley was best known for some of the earliest hominid fossils that we found. And just going through that area, it's huge. You cannot think of it as a rifting, because you can't see the other side to it. You can't see the older escarpment as is. And when you think escarpment, coming from India, coming from the Western Ghats, you're thinking of Western Ghats escarpments. And you're in Kenya and there's like this little tiny ridge. I'm like, oh, that's the escarpment. So it was pretty spectacular. But I think in that geography, more than anywhere else, the importance of human history and how the Maasai have really allowed that landscape to be as it is. You go there and it's 1,500 square kilometers of open grassland. Never seen so much open space in India without like construction somewhere. So yeah, just incredibly humbling and spectacular. I think the closest I've come in India to that vista is probably Kaziranga. Nowhere close, but Kaziranga's landscapes, my God. And that Brahmaputra flowing by, at some point you can't see the other side of the Brahmaputra, you think it's the sea. It's sandy and it's white sand. Spectacular. And in the middle of that you have the Majuli Island, which at some point in time was what? 450 square kilometers. Imagine an island in the middle of a river. What expanse has that river stretched to? Now, of course, it's wildly eroded and the island is much smaller, but I think Brahmaputra, as rivers go, is...
And also river dolphins.
Oh yeah, and that's great. And because they're so quick, a lot of people just wouldn't believe, I'm like, dolphin, and they're like, no way, dolphins here. But then yeah, that's quite exciting. Otters as well. There's so much happening on that edge.
This,
Please don't ma'am, Devayani.
landscape memory. What is the role of this drift tape?
Right. In some ways, sorry. I think the continental drift theory is a part of everything that we look at. In fact, when I'm talking to you about India being in the southern hemisphere at some point in time, that's the continental drift theory. And then from this one huge continent block, it breaks away, starts moving at this incredible pace north, crosses the equator at some point in time. As it continues further north, in fact, it passes what's today the Reunion Island. And at the time it passed over Reunion Island, which was roughly 66 million years ago, is when massive amount of volcanoes were happening, right? And that's what's caused our Deccan traps to happen. So think of it, when this little block was so far in the sea, and layers upon layers of volcanoes kept forming. So I think in a way it's the backbone of every landscape we speak of in India. In fact, speaking of the continental drift, if I had to start my story of India, the first place I would take everybody to would be Leh. And 30 kilometers away from Leh is a place that nobody goes to, called Lato village. And what's incredible, I don't have photos of Lato, but what's incredible about Lato is it represents a formation where the two plates collided. We've spoken about this. We talked about this in geography in school. We learned that India plate came, crashed into Asia, and started dipping under the Asia plate, right, and crumpling that entire thing. But what does it actually look like? And Lato village has these incredible crags. And I've taken a photo where the electricity poles look like tiny. And you just have these sheer formations which represent where that subduction is happening and what's in fact known as a suture. Right? A suture is like a stitch. And that's exactly what was happening. Two plates colliding, kind of getting stitched together. So I think in some ways that concept is there throughout, because even when you're talking about Nandi so long back in time, it was part of a different climate regime. It was part of a very different India. We're talking about pillow lava formations. Completely different landscape altogether. In fact, the pillow lavas came up from under the ocean surface, right? An oceanic plate that kind of cobbles together. And in fact, that's an interesting way to think of the Indian peninsula. Today we see it as one little triangle. But in some ways, it's little bits and pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle that's been stitched together, that someone's carefully crafted together to make it this little formation we see today. So I think in some ways that continental drift theory is at the, is the background for every landscape.
In our school days, they teach about wildlife, how.
Absolutely. I think that theory is as fascinating as it gets. It explains so
We
much.
should congratulate you. We should include in our pedagogy the way you explain this. Is very nice.
I
So
hope.
everybody can understand.
I hope.
Travel to Karnataka and travel to life.
Yeah, that's perfect. I feel we miss out. A lot of times when I tell people I studied geography, they're like, wow, it was so boring. And I said, I'm so sorry you felt that way, but we are at fault somehow of how we.
Even I didn't know that we can study geography like this.
Devayani, you mentioned wind speeds are lesser in India and
No.
hence erosions are less. right?
No, not wind speeds are lesser in India. Let me correct myself. I mean wind as an of the top agents, but there are landscapes like in Ladakh where wind is a major factor. But there's the Wild Karnataka documentary that was released a few years ago, I think now, it's been a few years, said Hampi is a wind eroded formation, and that's incorrect. Hampi is completely, so in fact, there's very simple ways to look at a landform. Detective trail, I told you, if a landscape looks like it's aerodynamic, smooth, then it may be wind sculpted. But if it's rounded, in fact, all of the boulders we find in rivers, then it's a water shaped landscape. Yeah, there was a question here.
A triangular portion of India is still moving northward or it is settled now with what speed it is moving?
So I think the speed is right.
Really dynamic.
Right. No, the speed is pretty variable. I've read papers that say something like 7 centimeters to up to 13 centimeters per year. Don't quote me on it because the science is changing all the time. And yes, in fact, yes, sir will know much better. It's correct.
Yeah, it's
Yes. Okay. But sorry. So the thing is, it's not actually just one zone which is changing, and there are multiple zones there where this is happening. And at some point, there are certain actions that happen. In fact, the Gorkha earthquake that happened a few years ago is an indication where suddenly that time component, the distance increases very rapidly. But yes, it's true that the plate continues to subduct under the Eurasian plate. We are getting crunched little by little, and the pace is changing. So you want to add anything to that?
That means height of mountain.
Everest will keep.
is increasing.
Yes, so whoever goes scales Mount Everest today will go a few inches higher.
Yeah.
Anyone scaling it. But yes, but it's barely, like it's, as I said, it's roughly 7 centimeters to 13 centimeters, so that's a foot more, maybe one step more.
Also, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು GPS ಅಳತೆಯಿಂದ ಅಳತೆ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಒಂದು 10 ವರ್ಷದ ಹಿಂದೆ ಅಳತೆ ಮಾಡಿರ್ಬೇಕು. ಸೇಮ್ ಮಿಲಿಮೀಟರ್ ಅಕ್ಯುರೇಸಿ ಮೇಲೆ ಸೇಮ್ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
Okay, sorry.
So this is low water.
Right.
But they have measured using GPS now. So the difference is roughly only about 10.
You told the difference, yearly difference is have ground control points. So we used to measure with the differential GPS. It is millimeter increments. The control point we measured 10 years back, reading the same value today also. So measuring
In the
is not
same
relative.
landscape?
So measurement is with respect to the satellites. So the same reading is giving here.
No, actually, it varies from place to place.
ಇನ್ನು ವ್ಯತ್ಯಾಸ ಆಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ ಗ್ರೌಂಡ್ ಕಂಟ್ರೋಲ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ EGPS ನಿಂದ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಅದೇ ಅಳತೆ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ಈಗ ನಾವು ಮೂವ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದೀವಿ, ಮೂವ್ ಎಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ. ಸೊ ಈಗ ಯಾವುದೇ ಅಬ್ಸಲ್ಯೂಟ್ ವ್ಯಾಲ್ಯೂ GPS ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತದೆ. ಈ ಸದ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ಗ್ರೌಂಡ್ ಕಂಟ್ರೋಲ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಇದನ್ನ ಸರ್ವೆ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಇದು ಮಾಡಿ ಅದೇ ಟೆಕ್ನಾಲಜಿ ಸೇಮ್ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಆಗಬೇಕಾಯ್ತು. ಒಂದು ಅರ್ಧ ಸೆಂಟಿಮೀಟರ್ ಆದ್ರೂ
What in case the measurements that is done in the area of land mapping, so they have not changed. So
control points.
Very interesting.
If the the movement is there,
Right.
then that should have been reflected in those measurements.
Actually, would it have been reflected? I mean, I'm not an expert on this particular topic. I did groundwater research as part of my master's, but I think the field has changed a lot since last century. But I would still think, sir, but your groundwater aquifer would remain similar. So if I had to guess at why that measurement may not change, I feel even with earth movements like that, I'm not really sure your aquifer is changing, but I might be wildly off. I don't know why. And I feel all the more reason why our scientific institutions need to publish this kind of data to answer questions like this, because this kind of knowledge is not in the public sphere, even for me to make a random guess like I am right now. We don't know enough, and it's never public knowledge. So I think our textbooks are ages behind the times, and our knowledge itself is pretty limited. Yes.
One more side. Right in Bengaluru. Okay.
Yes.
Please.
Okay. Yeah.
I've heard somewhere that the bull mover comes from Madagascar and has something to do with the I don't even know.
No, it was right. No. So Gulmohar, I mean, Delonix regia, but it's an import, colonial import.
It's not about.
No, not yeah.
More than that, Gulmohar.
Yeah.
Other wild animals.
Absolutely. Frogs, for instance, there's the purple frog.
Human-based import than.
Yes, the flora is, but there are other creatures across the Western Ghats that show these. Their closest relatives are in Madagascar, for instance. The purple frog is one of them. More recently, they found a few other lizards. So, geckos, right?
And I could say about the Gulmohar.
Yes, exactly. So when you had, but I think exactly. Yeah. But there's
I think we had ostriches also some 70,000 years ago.
cheetahs also. Sorry, you had a question.
In Bengaluru, Tiruvannamalai, one big hill is
In Silberg, right, yeah.
That's right.
Absolutely, all exactly the same formations, right? And in some ways, I think in India, it's a very interesting context that we have. That in some places, having temples on top of geological sites have helped preserve it. But a lot of times, it's also been a reason for destruction. Like outskirts of Pune, I remember in college, but this was like my first impression. There's a beautiful formation of what's known as river potholes. So you have an entire black rock structure which looks like someone's taken an ice cream scoop and carved out of. And what is it looks like Swiss cheese. Okay, you're looking at a formation which is almost 100 meters across and 50 meters deep, entirely ice cream scooped in dark black rock. Spectacular.
No,
What?
Also,
Actually,
that will
Tungabhadra.
make that.
Absolutely. But Meghalatu is still a gorge. Right.
It's a but
Formation potholes are. Actually, even the Tungabhadra does this along the Hampi stretch. So if you ever go make the mistake of going to Hampi in summer, you see the potholes. So it's those little things. But the scale at these Nighoj, the place is called Nighoj, and that Kukdi river must have been huge at some point in time because What you're thinking of is if a river had the power to carry a rock the size of that scoop, what a river it must have been. And the sad part is they built a temple there. Okay, I have nothing against temples, but they painted it white. You have black rock, you have all these things, and you have the temples. Painting hasn't been done well enough. It looks like a molten candle dripping there. People come there, Malganga temple, they ring the bell, they look in, and they're like, "Arey, in Marathi, they're like, oh, there are holes here," and they go. Like, it's just heartbreaking to see. Yeah.
Actually, I was wondering when you were talking about sites not being well known enough. Right?
Yes.
Isn't that also in some ways a benefit, just given our propensity as humans? to ravage what we
Maybe,
know?
maybe, but I feel in India we have so many UNESCO World Heritage Sites that in some ways we need that acknowledgement, that recognition for it to become. In my opinion, we have some world-class examples of geological and geomorphological processes. Without that formal acknowledgement, we've not seen any sites in India just because the government felt nice about it, preserving and conserving it. So yes, I do, like I agree, that's why I said I'm on two sides to it. I do know that there have been some temples that have helped preserve the landscape, but more often than not, it's caused destruction as well. So we need that recognition. Great.
I'm still curious about Yana. You said that
Yes.
there must have been a coral formation. And that is the field, and I'm just imagining how deep it could have been.
It needn't have been deep at all, in fact, because coral formations could be pretty shallow.
Yeah.
Yes, but now that it's high, that's true. And think of it this way, there are other limestone formations across India. So you have some in Andhra Pradesh. All of these are pockets of coral formation. So anywhere you see limestone formation, that was what was the prior condition to it.
You give people on walks.
It's few and far in between. I can't commit to it as much. I did one last year in Bangalore. Inselbergs, more than
So many
Inselbergs.
Inselbergs around here.
Yes, I could do, but you'll just hear more about Inselbergs. But there's a lot more going on. In fact, in the three of the many Inselbergs around Bangalore were very crucial to do the great trigonometric survey of India. So at some point in time, they needed, because South India, by and large, I stand corrected. So your Western Ghats is high enough, but the middle part of the peninsula is relatively flat. So what they needed were these outcrops, and so they used places like Savandurga to actually triangulate points. And this entire mapping of India that happened from the tip of the peninsula, sweeping across to the Everest, and finally measuring the height of the Everest. And then that same technique was pushed into all the way towards Afghanistan and all the way even into Lhasa, at which point they had to kind of stop. All of this was conducted by that same process of the Great Trigonometric Survey of India. And these Inselbergs were very, very crucial because they were the high points from which they could flash with the tools that they had at the time. So yes, there's a lot of other layers to that story. But as I said, I would have loved to take, I would always love to give a talk out in the wild, but it's not always possible. Tomorrow we are going, you want to join? We're going with some school kids. If there's nothing else, there are,
One
yes,
non-geomorphology question for you.
please,
You said your mother is doing PhD in some,
finish, yeah.
what subject?
Indian art and architecture.
Indian art.
Yes. Yeah. And I think this is why you can't ask me geology questions as much, because I've joked about it before, but the way our education is, I studied nothing about the rocks when I was studying, but I studied geomorphology, which is landscape evolution. So I can tell you how landscapes were formed. Don't ask me what rock was there below. There's nothing there. But yes, I think our education system has also kind of divided these subjects. So, I mean, it's a little strange to me. So geology is largely self-taught, and that's why lots of mistakes and lots of random theories. That's what makes it fun. I think all our subject matter needs to be like that, detective trails. There are postcards there. I haven't printed too many, so please just take one. You can subscribe to the newsletter if you're interested, or share it with somebody else who might be interested as well. Thank you so much. I'm open for questions informally once I get off the recording. Thank you so much for making time.